I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about a really evolving situation here in the United States, we're talking about a measles outbreak. 222 measles cases were reported in the United States, with one case in Maryland in the D.C. area. I have with us Dr. Steve Morrison. Steve is the head of our Global Health Policy Center, Senior Vice President at CSIS, and a great friend of the podcast. Steve, what is going on here? Can you tell us the basics behind measles, why they're so dangerous, what kind of harm it causes, and, why is there a huge outbreak in a place like West Texas?
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the chance to come and talk today. It's March 11th. It's a great moment to be talking about what's happening in West Texas, Gaines County, and what's happening in the neighboring Lee County in New Mexico across the border. Let me just give you a few basics about what's happening there, and then a few basics about measles itself. The current outbreak in West Texas and now New Mexico, it's been smoldering for some time, but not detected. It first came into view a little over a month ago and has escalated very quickly. As of last Friday, 238 cases, 30 of them in New Mexico. So it's spread. The population has moved it. Its transmission is spread into 8 or 9 neighboring counties, but most importantly into this one area. The real numbers, and this is an important thing, when you talk to the people who are working on the ground, the experts who are working on the ground with this outbreak, they believe the true numbers are much, much higher. They can't say with certainty, but they use numbers like 500 to 1,000 and rising.
Steve, most of us were vaccinated as children. What risk do we run, those of us who are vaccinated, of contracting measles?
If you have 2 doses of the vaccine, you're expected to be covered for your lifetime.
So this is a disease that the United States nearly eradicated, yet here in 2025, we've observed the worst outbreak in 30 years, highest rates of contraction in 6 years. What happened that led us to where we are today?
Let me say a few things about measles to try and answer that question. Measles is exceptionally infectious. It has an R rate of 18, which means that a person gets infected is likely to infect over the course of that infection 18 other people. This is an exceedingly high level of transmission. People get infected. They're not symptomatic for 3 or 4 days, but they're highly infectious. Their transmissibility continues for another 4 or 5 days. It passes in droplets or in the air, in aerosolized versions that can live on for a couple of hours on surfaces and in the air after the person has exited. The vaccine was first introduced in 1963. Vaccines, you have to have somewhere around 95% coverage in order to have herd immunity and avoid transmission. Your first dose gives you coverage of up to 93%. Your second up to 97%, has a very strong safety record. So as this was put into force in America, by 2000, we had eliminated measles in the United States.
Eliminated it.
We had eliminated it, but we have had outbreaks, serious outbreaks. We had an outbreak in 2019, very large outbreak in the Orthodox Jewish community in Williamsburg and Brooklyn.
Yeah, who are all unvaccinated.
And in Westchester. And it took a full year. There were 1,274 cases. Took a full year to bring it under control. And I want to make the point here, this was during the first Trump administration. Secretary of HHS Alex Azar was very vocal. The head of CDC was very vocal in encouraging people to get vaccinated. We dispatched teams to work with local authorities, to engage with community leadership, the leadership of the Orthodox community, to bring them around.
Well, and just, Steve, let's underscore this for a second. These folks were unvaccinated. Their children were unvaccinated. It was
Correct.
Part of their view that they shouldn't be vaccinated. So the people who are getting this, and I'm assuming the people who are infected in Texas now too, are people who are not vaccinated for the disease.
Correct. What is happening is we have close-knit communities which, for reasons of culture, ethnicity, religion, choose not to get vaccinated or to isolate when these outbreaks take place. In this instance, in Gaines County, Texas, you have a Mennonite population, 15 to 30,000 people. They migrated there from Mexico in the 1980s and 1990s. They had been in Canada before Mexico. They had been in Russia before that. This was a Mennonite population that settled there while they drove modern machinery. They took up modern medicine, prenatal care for pregnant women. They were not opposed to vaccines on religious ground, but they did not accept them, and they did not buy into the argument that vaccines are unsafe and that they should give up alternatives. And so this is what we have. We have an unvaccinated population that is quite insular and resistant, but we also have in the broader population lots of clusters of unvaccinated or undervaccinated populations. And that broader population is a population that has turned away from vaccines in the COVID and post-COVID era. And so we're seeing more kindling out in our society so that you have an outbreak that starts in something like this with the Mennonite population, and then it can be transmitted into these other zones where there are clusters of populations that are unvaccinated, undervaccinated. And that's one of the big threats that we have right now. In Gaines County, for instance, among the Mennonite population, the official figure on vaccination against measles is 82%. That figure is thought to be actually higher than reality because the Mennonite population is oftentimes not even recorded in these numbers. It's important also to realize that there is no antiviral for measles and there's no cure, and that measles can come in and it can kill one child in 1,000. It can cause high fever, pneumonia, and death. It tends to hospitalize 20% of those infected. It can blind people. It can lead to deafness. It can lead to mental impairment. It can lead to something called immune amnesia. That is, it can wipe out the accumulated immune protections you've acquired against other diseases and leave you prone to viral and bacterial infections coming from other sources afterwards. So it's a very dangerous virus if it's not contained. And the only real fix to this is vaccination. It's not some of the alternatives that are being pushed currently. Vitamin A, cod liver oil, antibiotics, and steroids. These are not prevention tools, nor are they particularly effective care tools, but they've been brought forward in a variety of ways as alternatives and marketed as alternatives. And we're seeing.
Let's talk about that for a second. Gaines County has really become a crisis battleground. It's a tale of two cities. And, what I think many are saying is an early urgent test of RFK Jr.'s, being the secretary of HHS. What are the opposing camps saying and what's actually happening?
Well, what we have here, we have a narrative that's coming from a variety of sources around breeding doubt about the effectiveness and safety of vaccines and encouraging these erroneous beliefs that there are alternatives in the form of cod liver, vitamin A, steroids, antibiotics. First, I'd say that there are online conspiracy angles and online campaigns. The Children's Health Defense, which was started by RFK Jr., has been very active in this domain, arguing you should stay away from vaccines and go for these alternatives. In Seminole, Texas, in Gaines County, the capital of Gaines County, you have a well-known MD who has gone over to the other side of these campaigns against vaccines, Ben Edwards, who has set up shop where he's dispersing cod liver oil and vitamin A and steroids and advising. And he claims he has served almost 200 families with sick children. So you have a movement, an anti-vaccine movement that's gained ground across the United States and contributed to declines in uptake of vaccines. It's taken hold particularly in these rural communities in West Texas. And then you have activist MDs in this area like Ben Edwards who have become almost cult figures in these communities. And then you have RFK Jr. himself come in. His initial statement when the announcement was made of the first death of a 6-year-old child, this was the end of last month, first death from measles in Gaines County of 6-year-old, said this rising outbreak, not unusual. He then, a couple of days later, posted a commentary on Fox News in which he said, yes, vaccines can be an important prevention tool, but it was a very backhanded statement. He mixed it in, and he gave a further interview on this. He mixed in that backhanded statement with a number of other false statements that natural immunity that comes from infection will protect against other diseases, which is the exact opposite of what happens. If you get infected, you can also lose your protection against other diseases. He made the claim that the cod liver oil, vitamin A, steroids, antibiotics have delivered miraculous results and deserve careful study. He says we underestimate the injuries of vaccines, the lack of safety of the vaccines, and he claims that the measles don't cause death. Now, that is the broad narrative. We have the first time ever in modern history, we have a secretary of HHS aligning with figures like Ben Edwards and aligning with, guess what? The personalities and the mindset from Children's Defense Fund, which he created 20 years ago. So that's one side of this narrative that's going on. The other side of the narrative is the pro-vaccine narrative, which the state health commissioner has launched a big campaign in 18 counties to expand the site for tests and vaccines, speed the turnaround on those tests, address the shortages of vaccines. And they've invited CDC to come in and strengthen communications and hospital infection control. So what happens now? What we're seeing now is improvements in the delivery of vaccines and the communications and advocacy for vaccines, but people are not showing up. The officials that are putting this program together are saying, yeah, this is all fine, but what we still face is a deep cultural barrier. We don't have arms to put those vaccines into. It's a kind of stark statement.
So, Steve, it seems to me, and you pointed out this is the first ever Secretary of Health and Human Services to take a position such as this that is at odds with science. It seems very unusual that we're in this situation. Is this also becoming a partisan issue, the health of people in America?
Well, this has become deeply partisan, the whole question around vaccines. And look, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has become secretary just a short while ago. This has become a very urgent and stark threat to his tenure, right? Because it comes in and puts front and center this whole question of, does he believe in vaccines or not? Or is he a skeptic and somebody who's going to continue to undermine public confidence in the vaccine enterprise? And look at the other steps that have been taken have raised the concerns along those lines. He suspended the CDC vaccine committee meeting, the ACIP. He canceled a similar meeting at the FDA looking at safety and efficacy of vaccines.
So he's not just talking about it, he's actually doing things actively that most doctors and scientists wouldn't recommend.
Correct. And he's instructed CDC to begin a study of the possibility that vaccines cause autism. Well, this is a charge that goes all the way back to Wakefield's erroneous and debunked argument in The Lancet in 1998 that has been debunked by study upon study upon study since that time, but has been a central tenet of Children's Defense Fund that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. founded in 2005 and carried until he resigned in 2023.
And that foundation was geared to do what exactly?
It was really one that challenged the legitimacy, the legality, the safety of vaccines. That was its central mission. And it made court cases and sought settlements and lived off of some of the settlements, but also built up a strong following. And the other point I want to make is COVID proved to be a massive gain, created a massive opening for the expansion of the power and influence of the anti-vaccine movement, and it eroded public trust and confidence, not just in public health, but in vaccines. And we've seen a steady drop among children, among kindergartners in this, and it's created vulnerabilities to these sort of outbreaks all across the country. But we're seeing this outbreak happen in this particular area where the circumstances are especially advantaged to trigger exactly this sort of thing. But we're going to see more of this in other places, which gets me to sort of what happens next.
Yeah, what does happen next? I mean, what's going to happen if we're fighting about this? How is it possible to, re-eradicate measles?
Okay, if we look at what happened in Ohio in 2014, there was an outbreak in the Amish community. 373 cases. It took 6 months to roll that back. The case with the Orthodox Jewish communities in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and in Westchester took full 12 months because there was great resistance to engaging with the leadership. There was great resistance to isolation and uptake of the vaccines to bring it under control. There's two scenarios. One scenario is the virus spreads through the community and it creates herd immunity through that broad and sweeping infection, and it burns itself out eventually. And that's what ultimately sort of brings us back to earth here, is that it just spreads. Under that scenario, I think you're likely to see a lot of children that are heavily damaged, that are hospitalized. We could see more death of children. You can see more blindness, more mental impairment, more deafness, more of this immune amnesia. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that it spreads from there and ignites similar outbreaks in other pockets, other clusters of unvaccinated populations by travel and by movement. That's what we've already seen in New Mexico. The population in Texas, in Gaines County, shops across the border at the Walmart in Lee County, New Mexico. So it's lit up that population. That population has a high number. We're entering a season where there's a lot of migration within the Mennonite community to visit relatives and sister communities of Mennonites in Mexico, in Canada, across the western part of the United States. One question is, are we going to see the spread and the transmission through that? We don't know. We don't know exactly how this is going to happen, but people are very nervous. The White House is nervous. Public health officials are nervous. This is going to take a long time. Kids could very well die in this process. And the Trump administration, Trump White House, knows that the poor performance on COVID response in 2020 played a terribly important role in his defeat in the 2020 election. There's awareness that RFK Jr. has been accused of contributing in 2019 to the deaths of 83 children in Samoa, where there was a massive outbreak in which he was discouraging people. I don't know if it's fair to say he's responsible or not, but there are allegations along those lines. So this could prove to be a really serious moment of reckoning for Secretary Kennedy and for the Trump White House itself. And it could become a broader set of challenges. I think the deeper challenge is what I referred to earlier, which is COVID began to erode the compliance by parents in getting their kids vaccinated. It's been a steady decline, and so there's a vulnerability to outbreak that we're seeing across the United States, and that is going to continue to be lit up, and we need to figure out what to do.
Okay, so this seems to be a budding crisis, PR disaster. It's a crisis of health, to be sure, but it also seems, as you just mentioned, to be a budding crisis of public relations for the White House. They're being pulled in lots of different directions and doesn't seem to have a clear direction that they yet want to go in. Is Kennedy capable of pivoting on this? What do you think is next for them?
Well, once we had the first death, CDC took about 30 days before it finally sort of put out a major guidance on what was happening. His first response was very clumsy, saying, oh, these outbreaks are not unusual.
His being RFK Jr.
RFK Jr. showed no compassion for the death of this child, no call for vaccines. He was heavily criticized in the press, heavily criticized internally within the administration. He then goes and issues a statement, a commentary on Fox News that Sunday, the 2nd of March, in which he said, yes, vaccines can prevent measles, but then went on to undermine his own position by adding in all of these other falsehoods about vaccines that sort of undermined his own opening assertion and led people back down the path of skepticism and doubt and the belief that there are alternatives like vitamin A or cod liver oil. So to answer your question, I don't think he is capable of pivoting. I think what we've seen is he goes back to where he's been for a very, very long time in his positions. And we're seeing that reflected in his response to this crisis. And we're seeing it reflected in the many policy initiatives that he's pushing forward in the first early days. That is a deep skepticism of vaccines, a belief that they have serious safety and injury risks that we have underappreciated, a belief in nutritional or supplemental vitamin alternatives in their exercise, and a desire to disrupt the system of committee experts and the like who explore these matters of safety and science and what does a good science tell us. And, implicit in all of this is an assertion that the science itself is degraded and false, and that he needs to come in and correct course.
But there's no indication that the science is erroneous, correct?
No. You were asked the question of, is he capable of change? And I would hope he's capable of change. I think the statement he made on the Fox News commentary was the closest he's come to endorsing vaccines, but he immediately undermined that assertion and then gave an even longer 35-minute interview with Fox 2 days later, in which he went out of his way to lay down a number of falsehoods about vaccines. So I think he is in the grip of many scientific falsehoods, and it doesn't seem to be showing any hesitation to continue to put these out. And it's going to be costly in his standing among Americans, including among conservatives. These issues are partisan, but only up to a point. The majority of Americans, Andrew, believe in vaccines. They believe in protecting the community against highly infectious threats like measles, and they don't want to see that break down. While we're a divided country and there's a partisan factor in all of this, I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that broader American society is going to be a bit confused and upset to see what's happening here. And a White House that has to worry about sustaining its support is going to, I think, increasingly be worried about what direction is this going. I don't know if the White House has the ability to shape or reshape or has the will to reshape what's happening there. But I think that's what we're seeing is an emerging crisis, an escalating crisis, one that could spread, as I said, under these two scenarios, could spread widely and quickly. It could also stay confined to that region, but cause great damage.
Steve, this is a lot to think about. It's a lot of scary stuff. Thanks for helping us understand it better. I know that we're going to be talking about this for some time. So thank you for this initial conversation, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it again on this podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.